So we are moving on to chapter 5, which is organic chemistry. So as people were figuring out how chemicals and chemistry worked with, water and things dissolved in water and minerals and that sort of thing, they knew that you could take living things and get them to do stuff that was kind of chemical. Organ, remember, organ is kind of connected to life. So organism, organic, organelle, there's all sorts of things with the word embedded in it. And at some point, people who are working on this stuff decided that to one extent or another, they could start to figure out how the chemistry that they were doing in the lab with test tubes and stuff could be applied to living things. And so they called it organic chemistry, the chemistry of living things. And one of the first things you do is try to break stuff down to see what's in it. If you dry up organic material, you dry up living material, and then you burn it to break it down, you wind up with carbon. And in its very earliest, organic chemistry was chemistry having to do with carbon. But before very long, it was pretty obvious that there was carbon in a lot of things that were not alive. Although sometimes they didn't know, right? Oil and coal have a lot of carbon in them, but nobody at that point knew that they were actually the remnants of ancient living things. So they didn't think that it was connected. As they messed around with the chemistry, they kind of amended the definition of organic chemistry because they always found that the carbon also had hydrogen, which is not something that you always found in minerals. And so they decided organic chemistry was carbon-hydrogen compounds. Really, they never really changed that. It's kind of stuck in that definition. It should really be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen compounds, because pretty much all organic chemicals have those three things in them. We talked about honk last time. Nitrogen is in organic compounds, but it's not in all of them. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen are in all organic compounds. There's 4 major classes of organic compounds. We're going to go through them one at a time, but I've got them up here just as kind of an introduction. We've got carbohydrates, which in their simplest form are these little rings. And we'll talk about that. These are sugars and starches. We've got lipids, which are fats, oils, and steroids, and other things other than that. They're a very short string with long strings attached. Each one of these carbons would have a long string attached. We've got proteins, which are made up of amino acids, but a protein is a string of these things. It's even a simple protein is tens, if not hundreds, and some of them are thousands of amino acids in strings. Then we have nucleic acids, Na, as in DNA and RNA, and they're again a little simpler, but they're long strings. So these are little to medium-sized molecules. These are little to medium-sized molecules. These are big molecules, and these are big molecules. So we're going to kind of work our way up size-wise. And what I'm going to try to do is do a video for each group so that the videos don't get super long. So we'll start with carbohydrates. So eventually they found, when they broke sugars and starches down, if you broke them down carefully, you didn't just necessarily burn them up, you would get carbon and water, hydrate. And they found that at its simplest form, that you got this as a formula. For what they call simple sugars, single molecule sugars. If you got 5 carbons, you got 10 hydrogens and 5 oxygens. Glucose, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. So that's 1 to 2 to 1 ratio was one of the early things that they found out. What they eventually discovered was for sugars, sugars form rings. Rings with an oxygen. I need my little pointer. There's the ring, carbon on each corner, except right there, there's a bridge for oxygen. Remember, oxygen in column 6 only got spots for 2 bonds, and so they tend to form bridges. Now, that ring can undo at the oxygen. And when that happens, that molecule, and this, one thing you have to keep in mind, on a molecular level, everything's moving, and even the molecules that, we can make a nice little, plastic model of this. What it won't show you is these things shake, is they vibrate, and sometimes they vibrate enough to kind of pop apart, especially a ring may pop apart at the weakest link, which is the oxygen. And you wind up with, shortly, for a short period of time, a string, and the oxygen is now double bonded to the carbon, which has, well, I don't want to get too far into this. The point I'm trying to make is this molecule is fairly reactive. This molecule's very reactive. But glucose is one of our major fuels for our cells. So we need it in circulation. That's what insulin controls. It stores glucose and, so that you don't have too much of it, because your cells will use it. And then when you need it back, it has your cells that have stored the glucose release it. But it does occasionally unwind, pop open and form these strings. Now that molecule will stick onto all sorts of other molecules and mess them up. So it'll stick onto proteins, it'll stick onto DNA, it'll stick onto cell membranes. And one of the theories about aging is that we gradually accumulate damage from this molecule sticking to things that are fairly permanent in our systems. And it just gradually messes them up. You can find this actually doing that. And interestingly, one of the symptoms of lifelong diabetes, like juvenile or type 1 diabetes, as they get older, they tend to age faster in a lot of ways, almost like something was making them age faster. And so that kind of holds up the idea that there's a lot of things that damage you through your lifetime. We already talked about oxygen radicals, but these things as well. Now, sugars are not always alone. They can stick together. And what you wind up with is, let me go back. So here's a carbon with an OH attached. On the other end is another OH. So there's an OH and an OH. To stick these two rings together, you're going to use that oxygen as a bridge. And to use the oxygen as a bridge, you got to get this off of one side and this off the other side to form that potential bond. And when you take an H and an HO, you wind up with H2O. This is not just true for this. Virtually any time you stick organic molecules together, when you're building proteins, you're building DNA, you're building starches, you're building lipids, is that this is the process. You're going to take two OHs, use that as an oxygen bridge, which means you got to hang on to one of the oxygens, and then you lose two H's and an O. So when they figured out what was going on, they went, okay, so water's coming out. Dehydration. And what are we actually doing? Well, we're making stuff. And for the same reason that we call stuff synthetic when it's man-made, synthesis is the process of making stuff. A lot of you already know that. It's an English word, not that used that often, but it's out there. So here's two somewhat dicey English words, but they're English words, which, you know, for terms is really good. It makes it easier to remember. So if you're putting amino acids together to make proteins, when you're putting sugars together to make smaller, slightly bigger sugars or make starches, which are really long strings of sugars, that process is dehydration synthesis. And now you can do the opposite. You can break sugars apart. You can break you can break proteins down. The opposite is called remember English? This is not English. This is what am I looking for here? This is Latin. Where the heck is it? Well, oh, here, it was right where I was looking. If we were in class, I'd be talking to myself too. If you're trying to break the end off of a string, this is a string of something, then you got to put the water back in to take up those two spots. And the water goes in, and part of it winds up on one side, part of it winds up on the other side. So the water winds up breaking. This is literally Latin for water, hydrolysis, breaking. And that's the opposite, is that instead of building, we're breaking down. And that's true whether we're breaking amino acids off of a protein or breaking sugars off of a long string of sugars, or we're breaking apart lipids off of that little 3 thing, and you get the H and the OH. Now, this often happens. I do not have the best memory in the world, and I learned a long time ago that a lot of times when you're trying to learn terms, there's a lot of 2 terms, making, breaking. And a lot of times it's easier to remember one of them than it is to remember the other one, because one of them connects to something. Water comes out, you're making stuff. Oh, okay, that's the process that makes stuff. What was the other one again? Well, I remember this and this go together. So I remember dehydration synthesis is like, what's the other one? Oh, hydrolysis, okay. So linking them in your head sometimes helps, at least it does for me. So what do we got? Most of the sugars in the world you can trace back to plants making them. They take carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide out of the air, water from the ground, and they slam the carbons together using light energy to make them stick. And the energy from the light becomes the energy that holds the carbons together, and that's photosynthesis. And they're making sugars. And that's ultimately where basically most of the fuel in the world comes from. Because these sugar molecules are going to be fuel. We talked about that in the very first chapter. So CO2 plus H2O. We also used this for the reaction last time. And this is glucose. That OSE ending, chemists decided a decent amount of time ago, that's how they were going to name carbohydrates. That they would always put an OSE on ending. And at that point, there were a few carbohydrates that had already been named. They hadn't followed that rule. You run into them every once in a while. The way we store sugars in our bodies, it's a long string called glycogen. It was named before this rule came along. But 99 times out of 100, if you see a chemical name with an OSE on the end of it, it's some sort of carbohydrate. Could be a sugar, could be a starch. We'll get to starches in a minute. You also will hear the term saccharides. That's from an old Latin word for sugar. So sucrose, cane sugar, is a disaccharide. It's actually a glucose and a fructose stuck together. And we have to break them apart to absorb them and use them. The glucose goes right into our fuel systems. The fructose is actually mostly used to help make lipids, among other things. This brings us to starches. Starches are long strings of sugars, long strings of sugars. Weird thing about carbohydrates is they tend to come in the little to the very big, but not all in between. Sugars are 2, 3, maybe 4 of those rings stuck together. Starches are long strings, stuck together in various ways. Is that they can be simple strings, they can be kind of branched strings, they can be cross-bonded strings, and that makes them different in terms of access. Is that, remember, the sugar is the fuel, and how do you access the sugar if it's all bound together? You got to break it apart. Now, there are some long strings of sugars that are technically not starches. We're going to kind of ignore that. Is that this thing called cellulose isn't always considered a starch. But what we've got here is potato starch, long string. What we've got here is glycogen. Remember, that's the one without the OSE ending. And it's pretty simple. It's just a string with a few side strings attached to it. And then you get plant fiber, cellulose, lots and lots of cross connections. Which brings me to the idea of you need more fiber in your diet. Why? It'll make you more regular. When we eat plant fibers, plant fiber is indigestible starches. Is it goes in one end of us and out the other because it is sticky for water. Adhesion, remember, the same thing that makes a paper towel sticky for water. It tends to, you can't get all the water out of the food going through. It softens your stool. It makes your stool softer because there's more water in it, and you can move stuff along the tube better. When you pull too much water out of the end product of your digestion, it gets more solid, it gets harder to push along, you get constipated. And so fiber is a pretty simple way of moving stuff through, moving stuff along. Plants, potatoes, make a starch that we can break down and get the sugars out of. That's why starches are very high calorie. There's lots of sugars in there once you break them down. Digestible starches. These both are made by the plants. Why? Well, this one's easy. That fiber is what's holding the plant together. It's what's holding the plant up. So the plant doesn't want to make it out of some molecule that's real easy to break down. That's going to be its form for its entire lifetime. So they will produce starches that are, to us, indigestible. To other animals that can eat grass or can, chew bark off of trees and stuff, is that they have a whole population of bacteria that make this stuff digestible. Almost no animals can digest plant starch directly, with their own chemistry. They almost all have these chambers full of buddy bacteria that do it for them. We don't have that. We're stuck with starches that are fairly easy to break down. Now, why are they easy to break down? Because the plant was planning on using the sugars that self later. Is that tubers, roots underground that we bred potatoes out of. That's bulbs for tulips. That's stored carbs that are going to sprout the next year and become another plant. So it's got to be able to break those down and build new plant out of it. So digestible starches are not there for our benefit. It's there so the plant can use them later. And for that, you want them to be relatively easy to break down. They don't digest it, but digesting and breakdown are basically the same thing. Okay, I could do each one separately. This is it for carbohydrates.